Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about 5 swords that I found surprisingly disappointing, and this is a follow-up video to the 5 swords that I found surprisingly good video. Folks have asked me for the other end of the spectrum, which I'm going to provide today. Now, this is 5 swords that I found surprisingly disappointing in one way or another. So it could be that I expected a bad sword and I got a worse sword, or it could be that I expected something good and got something mediocre. But either way, these are 5 swords that in one way, shape, or form disappointed me. This list isn't in any particular order, but if there was one that had to be in the number 1 spot, it would be this one, and it is a sword from Alui. I think that's how you pronounce it. I believe it's an Indonesian manufacturer that makes kind of one-of-a-kind swords, and I expected this sword not to be particularly good, but what I got was even more disappointing. It failed to sword on all levels of sword, and it was sold as a functional sword, and I don't believe it was that. So, not to say that everything from the company is bad, but this one in particular I found to be egregiously bad. The handle exploded on use. The handle was constructed of like thinly cast brass filled with resin of some kind, and it fell apart. While it was together, it was pokey and kind of hurt the user. The steel blade was made out of a cable steel, and it wasn't heat treated right, and it fell apart in a way that would be quicker than it should have been. The tang was constructed in a way that seemed woefully insufficient for any kind of sword. So there were many, many problems with this sword. It had a particular look that was neat, but it didn't pass really any level of scrutiny. I think from the practical side of using it to just hitting anything in general with it, it seemed insufficiently made. And again, I was expecting something that wasn't necessarily great. I saw all the pokey bits. I wasn't necessarily thinking that was great. I bought it knowing the handle had some issues, so I thought maybe that would be problematic. But what I didn't expect was that it would fall apart as quick as it did, or that it was basically like cast around epoxy, or that the tang had a little rat tail nubbin in it. That was profoundly disappointing, and it goes at the top of the list of maybe most disappointing sword I've ever reviewed. The second is a recent one. Now, this is, again, a sword I didn't necessarily expect to like. It was the Doomsday Katana from Scorpion Swords, and I reviewed this not too long ago. I pushed it to failure, and you can watch the video. You can watch the video on any of these, but more or less, I thought it was going to kind of be a big chungussy sword. I didn't expect it to be maneuverable. I didn't expect to like it very much, and I thought it would be cumbersome to move, but I thought it would hold up, and I was surprised at how easily it bent, and how easily it broke. Well, I guess easy isn't the right word. It made it pretty far in my testing. But considering that this is a robust end of days kind of weapon that's supposed to be maybe the most difficult thing I've ever broken, the fact that it kind of bent from side to side pretty easily, and that it broke on the croquet stake, not without any more difficulty than some of the kind of cheaper katanas that I broke. I was a little disappointed in the overall level of durability that it had. It wasn't a particularly expensive sword, and like I said, I wasn't expecting to like it. It didn't have any redeeming qualities. I wasn't moving it around and being like, oh, this is actually surprisingly nice. It was big and cumbersome, and I was ultimately disappointed with how long it held up. The next one I'm going to talk about is the Tsuki S SO5, and this one deserves to be on the list because of the price point primarily, and ultimately what it delivered, but maybe it's less egregious than some of the others. Fundamentally, though, this is a $3,000 katana that really failed to meet the expectations of what you would expect for a $3,000 katana. Citadel, Evolution blades, both of them make swords that are nipped and tucked and kind of pay special attention to the details you expect to see in a high-end Japanese sword. And Tsuki, while it commands the same price, doesn't deliver on the kind of the same expectation that you might have. The Ito was a little loose, some things were misproportioned a little bit, the polish wasn't necessarily great. You're still getting a lot of sword, but ultimately those features which you would expect to be done at a high level weren't particularly done at a high level. It's also worth noting that there are other manufacturers out there who post $3,000 swords and don't live up to the expectation either, but there's competition out there who does, and so it's a disappointing sword. I had reviewed some Tsuki swords in the past. I had given them similar gripes, and I was disappointed to see that when I got another one, it had some of the same problems that I had noted from years ago. I hope to see another example of Tsuki. In fairness, they have actually gone on their website and addressed some of the criticism that I made to their credit, and I'm seeing some improvement in newer models. So hopefully any future list that I make with disappointing swords won't include Tsuki. I do commend them for the improvements that they're making, but at the same time, the example that I got sent was disappointing. Fourth on the list is the Winless Battlecry Viking, and it's worth calling out I don't generally like Viking swords because I don't know how to swing them. It's a me problem. I love the way they look. I think they're beautiful objects, but at the same time, I just can't find a way to hang on to these things and have them not chew into the meat of my hand. People have tried to coach me on it. Derpy derp derp. So Point is, I always approach Viking swords with a slight level of disappointment expected, and this one was no exception. But the Battlecry is supposed to be a durable thing that people can go out and use. It's supposed to be not necessarily meant to be whacked into metal poles, which is what I do, but it is meant to hold up reasonably well, and that is not what happened. Now, it did happen. It actually held up to some of the tests that I did, but when I went to whack it on a metal pole, basically it broke off at the hilt and it exposed a part of the sword that looked like it was a little fragile, or at least should be a known failure point to somebody like Winless, who makes as many swords as they do. And so the fact that it broke when it did, where it did, was something that I found to be very disappointing. The last one to talk about here is something from Dawson Knives, and a sword friend sent me a Leonidas short sword kind of looking thing, and it was basically a raffle piece that went out from Dawson Knives. He won it and he sent it to me to check out and review, and this was supposed to be a relatively expensive piece, I believe over a couple $1,000s, and I can excuse knife makers making effectively big knives as swords. They lack some of the distal taper and profiling and dynamics that you might expect to see from a longer blade, or at least that I might expect to see from a longer blade, but that's not necessarily a big deal. You can make a big knife like a sword and it can still be awesome. This one, though, had a really laughably tied leather handle wrap. And again, somebody might excuse that and say you could take that off and it would, look fine underneath. But the grind lines were off on the edge bevels, and I thought that that was nigh inexcusable for a sword that was supposed to be of a reputably made American manufacturer that focuses on knives. Knife makers typically make their bevels in the same spot, and this one was just a little off, and it was a little off with something that had a relatively high price point. And so I thought that that was, again, disappointing. Now, folks have told me since making that video that that is an oddity. Maybe it was a piece for a raffle. Maybe it was, something they were given. Maybe this one was odd, but that was the one that I had to review. And anything coming out of Dawson Knives, even if it's for a raffle, kind of bearing the name, is going to be held to the same kind of standard as perhaps the rest of their stuff, because some wackadoo on the internet might go reviewing it and talking about it. Anyway, this thing, for the price tag that it commanded, I thought was disappointing. All right, that is my list of 5 disappointing swords. The list could go on, but I don't know that people have the attention span for it, so I'm going to stop here. I will finish off by saying, though, that these swords were disappointing to me. It doesn't mean that you have to dislike them. I think I've noted, at least on a few of them, some objectively bad things about them, but that doesn't mean you have to not buy them or hate them or dislike them or dog on the company or any of that kind of stuff. I'm sure the companies that make them also make good things. Maybe I just got weird duds, something like that. Or maybe I'm a nut job and you shouldn't listen to anything I have to say. The point is, these disappointed me. It's my own personal take. You can take that for what it's worth. That's all I got, though. Cheers, and thanks for watching.